The first time you hear the number, it almost feels abstract, 12 million souls taken from Africa over 4 centuries. But the number hides what it truly meant. Behind each figure was a face, a family, a small home made of clay and straw, a market where laughter once echoed. It hides the fact that for every one person who made it to the Americas, another died before even seeing the ocean. Some perished in marches that stretched hundreds of miles across parched land. Others were buried beneath the decks of ships that became floating tombs. The ocean that separates the continents, the Atlantic, was once described by sailors as a graveyard without a cross. The water itself, calm and shining under the sun, concealed what no one wanted to count: men, women, and children who never reached the other side. It was not a storm or war that killed them, but calculation. Merchants and captains measured life in profit margins. A cargo lost was a number written in ledgers, a risk absorbed, a cost of doing business. Welcome, my friend, to History in Ashes, where we don't just remember history, we sift through it, piece by piece, until we find the ashes of truth. If you're here, it means you care about the past, not the polished version in textbooks, but the raw, unsettling one. The version where power is cold and survival, sometimes, is an act of quiet rebellion. Before we go further, could you do me a small favor? Scroll down to the comments and tell me where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? I always find it fascinating that a story which began across the oceans can now reach someone thousands of miles away, maybe even at midnight, when you should probably be sleeping instead of watching history videos. And if you're new here, don't just drift away like an unclaimed ship. Hit subscribe, or else this channel might vanish faster than a colonial promise of freedom. Trust me. Without your support, History in Ashes might soon turn into History in Dust. Now, let's set sail. Imagine standing on the western coast of Africa sometime in the early 17th century. The air smells of salt and smoke. Palm trees stand against a wide blue sky, and the waves roll gently against the shore. Yet just beyond the beauty, the air carries another sound: iron clinking, voices shouting in multiple languages, and the thud of wooden barrels being rolled toward the docks. This coast would later earn many names: the Slave Coast, the Gold Coast, the Windward Shore. European ships lined the horizon, each flying a flag: Portuguese, British, Dutch, French. On board, sailors scrubbed the decks and checked the ropes, preparing for the next cargo. That cargo was not gold or ivory. It was people. At the heart of it all stood the factories, not factories in the industrial sense, but fortresses built of stone. Inside them, local rulers, traders, and European merchants met to negotiate. Slaves, men, women, and children, captured in inland wars or raids, were brought in chained lines, their necks bound with wooden yokes. Some came from hundreds of miles away, walking for weeks. Many died along the way, their bodies left by the roadside, unnamed. What is chilling is how normal it seemed to those who ran it. There were contracts, receipts, and price lists. One could find in old company ledgers precise records of how much rum, gunpowder, or cloth could buy a man, a woman, or a child. Economists of the day discussed it as trade no different from sugar or spices, the everyday paperwork of evil. European sailors often described their first visits to these forts as confusing. They could hear laughter, trading songs, and cries all in one breath. The coast smelled of sweat, seaweed, and fear. Some captives were held in dark rooms with barely enough space to sit. The walls dripped with humidity, and the only light came through small barred holes. When the ships were ready, hundreds would be led out, branded, and forced onto small boats to be ferried to the waiting vessel offshore. The first moments on a slave ship were not chaos, they were order. Everything was arranged by routine. Men were shackled in rows, women and children were separated. The sailors had done this many times before. They knew how to stack bodies in ways that allowed for air to pass through the decks, just enough to keep them alive, but not enough to let them move. Survival, from that moment, became a test of will. And yet, in the middle of this horror, there was life. People whispered names to each other, prayed quietly, and remembered songs. A few carried charms hidden in their hair or beneath their collars. These small acts of remembrance were the last ties to the lives they had lost. It is easy to imagine this story as distant, something buried in the past, but at that time, the trade was one of the largest engines of global wealth. The sugar on European tables, the cotton in American mills, the rum in Caribbean taverns, all of it traced back to this system. Every ship that left the African coast was a moving part of a vast triangle that linked continents in an unholy rhythm. Manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, and raw goods back to Europe. By the mid-18th century, the trade had reached its peak. Some ports saw dozens of ships a month. The waters off the coast of Senegal, Sierra Leone, and the Congo River became highways of misery. On maps, they appear as lines, routes, currents, trade winds. But beneath those lines lie millions of stories never told. A single voyage could last from 6 weeks to several months. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, fever, and despair claimed lives daily. Captains recorded losses as percentages. 10% loss was considered acceptable, 20% unfortunate, 30% disastrous. Yet the trade continued. Each death was written off as an expense. There are old logs describing how, in times of sickness, captains would throw the dead and dying overboard to prevent contamination. The ocean, vast and indifferent, took them silently. Sailors would later speak of the water turning darker near the ships, thick with what they called the cargo's remains. Still, the ships kept coming. The profits were too high to stop. In Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, merchants built entire fortunes from this system. Banks, insurance companies, and governments all benefited. Even churches were involved, offering blessings to ships before departure. History, after all, has a strange ability to make even cruelty appear bureaucratic. But beneath the ledgers and the politics was something that can't be measured: the resilience of the human mind. Survivors of the Middle Passage carried their cultures, languages, and beliefs into new lands. From them emerged music, stories, and traditions that would later influence entire continents. Out of ashes came memory. As we move deeper into this story, remember this history is not only what happened, it's what people chose to remember and what others chose to forget. When the ocean settled each evening, sailors often described hearing strange sounds from below deck, soft humming, rhythmic tapping, or faint songs in unfamiliar tongues. They thought it was madness, but it wasn't. It was survival, the act of keeping identity alive, even when everything else had been taken. The story of the Atlantic slave trade doesn't begin with slavery itself. It begins with the human instinct to endure, to remember one's name, even when the world insists you no longer have one. And as we leave this first shore, I'll ask you this. If memory itself can be taken, how do we rebuild what was lost? You would not notice it at first. From a distance, the coast looked like paradise sunlight glinting off calm blue water, green hills rolling into white sand, canoes gliding silently across the surf. But as you drew nearer, the illusion faded. The air thickened with the smell of sweat, salt, and fear. Wooden palisades and stone fortresses rose above the shore, like open mouths waiting to swallow whoever approached. These were the factories Elmina, Cape Coast Castle, Whydah, Bunce Island, Ouidah. They lined the coast from Senegal to Angola, built and rebuilt by European powers who competed fiercely for a share of the trade. Their walls were made of coral stone and brick, whitewashed by the sun, and behind those walls, history was recorded in chains and ledgers. Each morning, long before dawn, the fort would awaken. Soldiers opened the gates, traders gathered their goods, bolts of cloth, copper bars, beads, muskets, rum, and gunpowder. Outside, the beaches filled with local middlemen, interpreters, and African chiefs' representatives. The trade was not a one-sided crime of invasion. It was a system, deeply intertwined with local politics, rivalries, and economies. Wars inland produced captives, and those captives became currency on the coast. A chief might trade 20 men for a dozen muskets, or a few barrels of rum for a handful of women. These exchanges were formal. Contracts were signed, gifts exchanged, and rituals performed. Sometimes the European traders would offer red cloth, brass jewelry, or mirrors, unaware that each transaction reshaped the balance of power far beyond their sight. Entire African kingdoms rose and fell under the weight of this commerce. Inside the forts, rooms were small and airless. The male dungeons lay below ground, narrow, dark, and filled with bodies pressed so close together that movement was almost impossible. The female dungeons were smaller, built near the officers' quarters. The walls were damp, the ceilings low, the air heavy with rot and human waste. In the corners, rats fed on discarded food. Some captives prayed aloud. Others sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the small slice of light that entered through a grated window. Above them, European officers conducted business. In the courtyards, they smoked pipes, checked ledgers, and discussed the next shipment schedule. The sound of hammering and shouting drifted through the halls, carpenters repairing barrels, sailors carrying casks of water, clerks counting supplies. To them, this was a normal day. At the center of every fortress stood a church. Sunday services were held with solemn hymns and polished brass crosses. The same men who prayed upstairs ordered the movement of captives below. They called it trade, not sin. They said they were bringing civilization to the heathen world. In letters sent back to Europe, they described the forts as settlements of order and faith. But below their feet, faith was being tested in ways words could never describe. The traders' diaries tell small details that reveal how mechanical it all became. One French officer wrote about how he measured the height of captives to decide who could endure the voyage. Another noted that he preferred to ship more men than women because the males bring greater return. In British and Dutch accounts, enslaved people were often described by condition fit, weak, spoiled, likely to recover. Even children were recorded as half units, valued at a fraction of an adult. But there were other entries too, moments of discomfort and humanity leaking through the ink. A Dutch clerk once wrote that the cries of the prisoners echoed through the night, like waves striking the walls. A Portuguese sailor, unable to sleep, described feeling haunted by the sound of breathing from below. Still, they kept their jobs, collected their wages, and sailed again. One of the most feared places along the coast was the Door of No Return. You can still see it today at Gorée Island, off the coast of Senegal. It is a narrow archway, opening toward the sea. Thousands, perhaps millions, passed through that door. Once they stepped through it, they would never see their homeland again. The door's stone frame is smooth from centuries of touch, the last contact of human hands reaching for a world they were being torn from. Standing there now, you can feel the silence. Tourists visit, whispering, taking photos, but if you stand still long enough, the wind seems to carry voices faint, overlapping, ancient. That silence speaks louder than any monument. The trade was not only African and European, it was global. Indian textiles, European metal, American rum, and African captives, all intertwined in one economy. Every port had its rhythm, its bargains, its quiet tragedies. Along the Bight of Benin, Portuguese merchants paid African brokers with brass bracelets, called manillas. Along the Congo River, Dutch traders used blue glass beads. These were currencies of pain, beautiful objects exchanged for human lives. Sometimes, captives would rebel even before leaving shore. There are recorded cases of people breaking chains, setting fires, or throwing themselves into the sea rather than board the ships. Some drowned within sight of land, preferring death to slavery. Others were caught and punished, as examples whipped, branded, or executed in front of the others to discourage resistance. The logic of the trade demanded obedience, and disobedience was costly. Inland, the system fed on instability. African states like Dahomey and Ashanti built militaries around slave raiding, while others tried to resist and were crushed. Some chiefs refused to trade with Europeans and found themselves attacked by neighbors who did. The trade reshaped borders, created new elites, and destroyed old traditions. It turned human lives into a resource, the most profitable one of all. Yet not every African participant was complicit in cruelty. Some traders acted under pressure, forced to engage in the system or lose their power. Some helped captives escape. A few priests and elders condemned the practice publicly, calling it an abomination. Their voices, however, rarely reached European ears. In letters and reports, they were dismissed as obstacles to progress. Inside the forts, time moved slowly. Captives waited weeks or months before a ship arrived. Disease spread easily. Food was scarce: maize, beans, dried fish, and water rationed to the bare minimum. The stench of confinement seeped into the walls. For many, this waiting period was worse than the voyage that followed. They lived in uncertainty, not knowing which ship they would board, or whether they would live long enough to leave. One European surgeon wrote in his logbook that the captives' eyes held a look beyond despair, as though they were already ghosts. But even ghosts leave marks. Archaeologists have found fragments of pottery, beads, and carvings hidden in the dungeon walls, evidence of people trying to hold on to something familiar. A bead might have been a symbol of home, a carving, a memory of freedom. Meanwhile, ships kept arriving. They came from Bristol, Nantes, Lisbon, Amsterdam. Each vessel carried trade goods and returned with sugar, tobacco, or cotton. Some ships belonged to great companies: the Royal African Company, the Dutch West India Company, the Compagnie du Sénégal. Behind each company stood investors, shareholders, and governments. The Atlantic world's economy revolved around these journeys. For every ship captain, there was a contract that outlined profit sharing. The more captives delivered alive, the greater the reward. Mortality was a measurable variable, one that could be minimized through efficient loading and proper ventilation. It was the language of commerce applied to suffering, but behind that language were real people chained, coughing, whispering prayers to gods whose names the Europeans could not pronounce. When storms approached, some captives believed the sea itself would protect them. They sang quietly, hoping the water would rise and swallow the ships. In a few cases, it almost did. Hurricanes and tempests sank hundreds of vessels over the centuries, scattering bones and iron across the ocean floor. Even in death, the trade left marks on the landscape. The forts became hubs of mixed cultures. Languages blended: Portuguese words merged with African dialects, English with local tongues. Children born along the coast sometimes grew up speaking 3 or 4 languages. They lived between worlds, the world of the captors and the world of the captured. At sunset, when the traders finished their business, the beach would empty. Fires burned near the forts, and the sound of drums echoed inland. Some said those drums were warning signals from villages telling others to stay away. Others said they were mourning songs, calling out to the spirits of the lost. The truth may be somewhere in between. Every now and then, an official report would reach Europe describing unrest on the coast uprisings, attacks on forts, ships burned or seized. These were quickly suppressed. But each incident left behind stories of resistance that history tried to erase. If you could stand there now, on that same shore, the waves would still sound the same. The ocean does not remember, but it does not forget either. It carries everything, the whispers, the screams, the echoes of chains striking wood. And as the moon rises over the dark water, a question lingers. How many voices can disappear before silence itself becomes a kind of language? If you were to draw it on a map, it would look deceptively simple, a triangle connecting three continents: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But that triangle was not just lines on paper. It was the beating heart of an empire of profit and pain, a route through which goods, people, and ideas flowed for over 4 centuries. Historians later called it the triangular trade, though the people who built it rarely thought of it in geometric terms. To them, it was logistics, an efficient cycle of supply and demand. From European ports, ships carried manufactured goods to Africa: guns, textiles, beads, alcohol, and metal wares. From Africa, they transported enslaved people across the Atlantic to the Americas, a voyage known as the Middle Passage. And from the Americas, ships returned to Europe, loaded with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. Each leg of the journey fed the next. Nothing was wasted. Every voyage was calculated to maximize profit and minimize risk. The success of this trade depended not only on cruelty, but also on organization, a kind of cold, methodical order that treated human life as inventory. The system began in the late 15th century, with Portugal's explorations along the African coast. By the 16th century, Spain joined, sending enslaved Africans to its colonies in the Caribbean and South America. The Dutch, English, and French followed, transforming what had once been sporadic trading into an industrial enterprise. By the 17th century, nearly every major European maritime power was involved. European ports became gateways of empire. Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Bordeaux, Lisbon, and Amsterdam all thrived on the Atlantic economy. In these cities, merchants built fortunes, shipyards expanded, and banks grew. Investors could purchase shares in slaving voyages, much as one might invest in a company today. It was business organized, insured, and deeply embedded in society. A typical voyage began with months of preparation. Merchants would gather cargo: iron bars, cloth, gunpowder, and beads. They stocked rum, wine, and food for the crew. Ships were refitted with wooden platforms inside the hold, creating narrow spaces where captives would later lie chained shoulder to shoulder. Water barrels and disease medicine, often mercury or vinegar, were loaded on board. Everything had its place. Everything had a number. In ledgers, the enslaved were called pieces. A strong man might count as one full piece, a child, half. The mortality rate was accounted for in advance, as if death were just another column in the balance sheet. When the ship finally set sail for Africa, it carried the dreams of many backers, nobles, merchants, investors, even priests. Some had never seen the ocean, yet their money funded voyages that stretched across half the world. Upon reaching Africa, the crew would anchor offshore, waiting for brokers and middlemen. They traded their goods for captives collected inland. A few ships stayed for weeks, others for months. Every day cost money, and every day more captives were brought to the coast. Once the hold was full, sometimes hundreds of people crammed into a space meant for a fraction of that number. The second leg of the triangle began, the Middle Passage. From the African coast to the Caribbean or Brazil, the voyage could last 6 to 12 weeks, depending on wind and current. The ships followed predictable paths south to the Cape Verde Islands, westward through the trade winds, then north again toward the Caribbean. The routes were chosen not only for speed, but for survival. Captains learned to read the wind as carefully as a merchant reads a contract. In Europe, entire industries were built to support this trade. Ironworks in England forged shackles, chains, and bars. Textile mills in France and the Netherlands produced cheap cotton cloth used as currency in African markets. Gun manufacturers supplied weapons that fueled wars inland. Even breweries and distilleries profited. Rum and brandy were among the most sought-after goods along the African coast. Insurance companies, too, found opportunity. By the 18th century, ships could be insured against loss of cargo, including the loss of human lives. In London, Lloyd's of London began as a coffee house where merchants gathered to discuss such risks. The discussions were technical, even polite, though what they truly measured was human misery. When a slaving voyage succeeded, the profits could be enormous. A ship leaving Liverpool with goods worth a few £1,000s might return with sugar and tobacco worth 5 or 6 times that amount. In a world before industrial capitalism, this kind of return was irresistible. The wealth built cities, funded wars, and laid the foundation for modern financial institutions. Yet at the center of it all stood the enslaved person, the one who bore the weight of every transaction. For them, the triangle was not commerce, but captivity. The European factory on the coast, the ship across the Atlantic, and the plantation in the Americas were 3 points of a single, unending prison. In the Caribbean and Brazil, where most enslaved Africans were taken, plantations became engines of production. Sugar was the gold of the era, the white gold that sweetened Europe's tea and coffee. It required vast labor, and the demand was endless. Planters bought new slaves every year, expecting most to die within 7 years. To meet that demand, ships sailed in a near-constant rotation. Between the years 1700 and 1800 alone, over 7 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Some ports sent out ships monthly, their sails filling the horizon like a grim parade. Back in Europe, consumers rarely thought about where their luxuries came from. They drank tea with sugar, smoked tobacco, wore cotton, and counted their prosperity as a sign of progress. The suffering that produced it was invisible, distant, abstract, buried beneath ledgers and shipping manifests. The triangle was not just economic, it was cultural, political, and psychological. It reshaped nations and identities. In Africa, societies fragmented and reformed around the trade. In the Americas, entire populations were created through forced migration. In Europe, moral justifications evolved to keep pace with profit. Some called it destiny, the spreading of civilization, the Christianizing of heathens, the expansion of commerce. Others, even then, saw the hypocrisy. A few clergymen and philosophers in Britain and France began to question the morality of a system that preached salvation while practicing bondage. But for most, the wealth spoke louder than conscience. Even ordinary people became part of it without realizing. Fishermen sold supplies to slaving ships. Farmers provided food. Rope makers, carpenters, and dock workers all depended on the trade. In this way, the triangle ensnared not just continents, but entire societies, all turning, unknowingly or not, on the same invisible axis of suffering. If you could follow one ship's journey, let's say from Liverpool to Bonny, from Bonny to Jamaica, then back to England, you would see the world's first truly global economy in motion. In Liverpool, it would load barrels of rum and crates of cloth. In Bonny, it would take on hundreds of captives bound for the Caribbean. There, they would be sold to planters, and the ship would be filled again, this time with sugar and molasses. When it returned to England months later, its profits would be divided among investors, and preparations for the next voyage would begin immediately. The triangle never stopped. It fed itself endlessly. Each return voyage carried not only goods but also new orders, contracts for weapons, textiles, and iron to be sent again. It was a machine with no heart, driven by markets that valued everything but mercy. As the 18th century progressed, the triangle expanded. North American colonies became increasingly involved. Boston, Newport, and Charleston sent ships to the Caribbean and West Africa, competing with European powers. Local industries grew around shipbuilding and rum production, linking the colonies directly to the trade. The wealth generated helped fund the very revolutions that later spoke of liberty and equality. A bitter irony that history still struggles to reconcile. In time, the triangular routes would connect to another kind of trade, the exchange of ideas. News of revolts, abolitionist movements, and philosophical debates traveled along the same winds that once carried chains. The Atlantic became not just a route of commerce, but of conscience. But before that awakening came centuries of normalization. The triangle became tradition. Its rhythms were as predictable as the tides. Children in European port cities grew up watching the sails appear on the horizon and thought of them as symbols of prosperity. In reality, each sail carried the weight of countless lives. When you look at an old map now, the routes are marked in fine ink-thin lines crossing vast blue spaces. They seem harmless, elegant even, but each line hides storms, diseases, hunger, and silence. Each line represents a path carved through human despair. It is tempting to see history as a series of events, voyages, laws, empires. But beneath those events were ordinary acts. Hands counting coins, pens scratching on parchment, hammers nailing boards, ropes tightening around wrists. The triangle was built not by monsters but by people, pragmatic, industrious, convinced of their necessity. That is perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. And so the question remains, if an entire world could justify profit over humanity once, what prevents it from doing so again? The Middle Passage is often described as the most harrowing segment of the Atlantic slave trade. It was not a place marked on maps, nor a single journey, but rather a network of crossings spanning hundreds of years, stretching from the West African coast to the Americas. Yet, despite its repetition and scale, each voyage was an ordeal of unimaginable suffering, meticulously recorded in ship logs, ledgers, and occasional survivor accounts. From the moment the enslaved were brought aboard, the journey became a question of survival, engineering, and calculation. Captives were often packed into holds below deck, lying side by side with little space to move. Wooden platforms, sometimes 2 or 3 levels high, were built to maximize capacity. A single man might occupy only 30 inches of width, forced to remain in chains for weeks. Children, women, and the elderly were stacked in spaces only marginally larger than a coffin. Water and food were rationed strictly. Crew members carefully measured out small portions of maize, salted fish, beans, or dried yams. Fresh water was limited, stored in barrels, and often contaminated. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, smallpox, scurvy, and fevers claimed many before the ships even sighted land. Captains calculated mortality rates in advance. A loss of 10% might be tolerable, 20% caused concern, and anything higher could be considered a financial disaster. Each death was recorded not with sorrow, but as a line item in the ship's log. Hygiene was almost impossible. Human waste pooled in the lower decks, mixing with sweat, vomit, and the smell of rot. Rats and lice infested the holds, feeding on scraps and disease alike. Crew members sometimes sprayed vinegar or brandy to control odor, though such measures barely alleviated the conditions. Light came only through small grates in the ceiling or hatchways, leaving the interior in near darkness. The captives, however, found ways to endure. They whispered to each other in native languages, clinging to memory as a source of strength. Mothers tried to shield children from the worst, singing softly or humming rhythms familiar from home. A few carried charms, amulets, or small carvings hidden beneath their clothing. These objects became talismans, symbols of identity that could not be stolen even by chains or walls. Ships varied in size, but many carried between 300 and 600 enslaved people. Some vessels exceeded 1,000, an overcrowding that made death inevitable. Crew members, often European sailors with no prior exposure to African culture, recorded their observations clinically. Logs described rebellion attempts and noted punishments, such as shackling hands and feet, whipping, or confinement in iron chains. Some ships employed nets or barricades to prevent captives from attempting suicide by jumping overboard. Resistance was common despite the risk. Captives attempted to revolt on ships, sabotage sails, or starve themselves. In some documented cases, groups of men coordinated to seize weapons or overpower guards. Such incidents were typically suppressed with violence, yet they reveal the resilience and agency that persisted even in the most controlled environments. The physical toll was only part of the ordeal. Psychological suffering was immense. Captives faced the loss of homeland, family, and identity. European traders attempted to erase these connections by separating men from women, children from parents, and friends from allies. This deliberate fragmentation was intended to reduce the likelihood of organized resistance. It also deepened despair, though it could never fully extinguish hope. The duration of the voyage depended on currents, wind, and distance. From the Bight of Benin to the Caribbean, it could take 6 to 12 weeks. From Angola to Brazil, several months. Weather conditions influenced mortality. Storms could crush hulls, break masts, or sweep men overboard. Heat and humidity created suffocating conditions below deck. Sailors occasionally referred to the hold as a stinking inferno. And such descriptions, clinical as they may be, scarcely capture the experience. Water management was critical. Crew members measured barrels carefully and rationed each person a daily allotment, often insufficient to prevent dehydration. Food was similarly controlled, delivered in small portions on wooden trays through grates or hatches. The captives had little opportunity to eat properly, and malnutrition weakened their bodies, making them more susceptible to disease. Ships were also organized with rigid hierarchies. Captains and officers maintained discipline with precision. Crew members were responsible for the maintenance of the vessel, navigation, and overseeing the captives. Sailors were often poorly paid, poorly fed, and vulnerable to disease themselves. Yet, their authority over the enslaved was absolute. Every task, counting heads, cleaning the deck, securing chains, reinforced the structure of oppression that defined the voyage. Some captives were selected for specific tasks, such as cleaning the deck, tending to fires, or helping other captives survive. These roles were precarious, exposing them to greater punishment if they failed or defied orders. Others were too weak or young to assist, remaining passive observers of suffering around them. Survival depended on resilience, adaptability, and often sheer luck. The Middle Passage was also a conduit for cultural survival. Oral traditions, songs, and prayer persisted despite efforts to suppress identity. Certain rhythms, chants, or calls functioned as communication between captives, signaling danger, offering comfort, or preserving memory. These practices became a foundation for cultural continuity once enslaved people arrived in the Americas. Music, storytelling, and ritual served as subtle forms of resistance against dehumanization. Logistics of care, however minimal, were driven by economics. Captains and merchants calculated how best to maximize the number of survivors for sale at the destination port. Illness or death reduced profits. Some captains documented treatments, bleeding, herbal remedies, or rudimentary hygiene measures. Others ignored illness entirely. Death was routine, and inhumanity was codified into every operation. Despite the overwhelming conditions, some captives survived by forming alliances or creating small networks of support. Older men might mentor younger ones, women might share water or food, and groups would coordinate quiet forms of reassurance. These acts of solidarity were small, but they preserved humanity in a system designed to erase it. Upon arrival, the final stage of the Middle Passage began: inspection and sale. Captives were examined by planters or traders, often stripped, prodded, and assessed for physical fitness. Prices were assigned based on age, strength, and perceived adaptability to plantation labor. This process, though systematic, was brutal, reducing human beings to commodities. The psychological impact was immense. Even those who survived the crossing faced an unfamiliar environment, forced labor, and separation from any remaining family. Yet their survival during the Middle Passage itself demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for endurance. It was not merely physical survival, but the preservation of identity and community under extreme duress. Records from the period indicate that mortality rates varied by route, season, and ship condition. Some voyages lost as much as 30% of captives. Others maintained losses under 10% through careful provisioning and management. Yet each number represents a human life, disrupted or extinguished, an experience impossible to quantify fully. The Middle Passage also reshaped maritime practices. Ship design, navigation, and cargo management evolved specifically to accommodate human freight. Platforms and bulkheads were reinforced, ventilation techniques adjusted, provisions calculated with precision. These technological adjustments reveal the extent to which commerce and dehumanization were intertwined, reflecting a system both ingenious and morally bankrupt. Even beyond the hold, life on deck was precarious. Storms could overturn boats, waves could wash men overboard, and disease could spread rapidly. Crew members faced hazards as well, though they retained relative privilege. Captives, however, were exposed to every risk without protection. Survival was contingent on weather, skill, and endurance factors outside their control. The Middle Passage was not uniform. Some ships took measures to ease suffering, providing slightly more space, water, or minimal medical attention. Others treated captives as expendable. Across all voyages, the experience was a combination of routine, terror, and endurance. It became a defining feature of the Atlantic slave trade, shaping the demographics, cultures, and histories of the Americas for centuries to come. By the time the ships reached the Caribbean, Brazil, or North America, months had passed. Survivors disembarked to a new reality: markets, branding, and labor that would define the rest of their lives. The ocean had carried them alive, but not intact. Memory, culture, and language were preserved in fragments, often hidden beneath the trauma imposed by the voyage. The Middle Passage was a testament to human endurance in the face of systemic cruelty. It was a journey measured in chains, disease, and profit, yet it was also a crucible of survival, identity, and resistance. Its impact reverberated far beyond the decks of the ships, shaping entire societies, economies, and cultures across continents. And as the ship's shadows receded on the horizon of the Americas, the question remained: how does one measure survival when the price of existence is complete erasure of the self? When a ship finally reached the Americas, the Middle Passage was over, but a new chapter of suffering had just begun. The landfall was a calculated moment, executed with precision. Ports like Kingston in Jamaica, Bridgetown in Barbados, Salvador in Brazil, and Charleston in South Carolina were centers of human commerce. Here, the enslaved were examined, sorted, and prepared for sale not as people, but as assets, to be evaluated for strength, age, and ability to perform labor under brutal conditions. Disembarkation was organized with almost mechanical efficiency. Captives were ordered onto docks, stripped to assess their physical condition, and sometimes branded with the mark of the owning company or plantation. Merchants and planters inspected teeth, muscle tone, and stamina. Children were weighed and observed. Women assessed not only for physical fitness, but often for their ability to bear children in the future. These assessments were catalogued in writing, turning every human life into a ledger entry, a commodity ready for trade. For the enslaved, this moment was psychologically devastating. After months at sea, they faced the immediate terror of unfamiliar territory and strangers with authority over their lives. Some tried to resist, fleeing into nearby forests, jumping into rivers, or refusing to comply. Many were beaten or chained to enforce compliance, but resistance persisted nonetheless. Despite the overwhelming circumstances, acts of defiance, small or large, were common. Sale days were orchestrated public events. Buyers, often plantation owners or intermediaries, would inspect the enslaved, negotiate prices, and claim ownership. Auctions were formal and brutal. Captives were displayed, examined, and sold according to their perceived value. Older men might fetch lower prices, young men and women higher. Children, even infants, were assessed for future potential. Observing these transactions was often the first direct encounter with the full magnitude of the system's cruelty. It is here, at this juncture, that the human cost of the trade became most visible. Families were separated deliberately, men sent to work in sugar fields, women to domestic labor or rice plantations, and children scattered. These divisions were meant to prevent communication, maintain control, and suppress resistance, but they also fragmented centuries of cultural knowledge and community ties. Despite these separations, survivors carried fragments of home languages, beliefs, songs that would influence generations to come. Life on the plantations was regimented, grueling, and dangerous. The work depended on the crop. Sugar, one of the most profitable commodities in the Americas, required long hours of intense labor under scorching sun. Fields were vast, cane cut by machetes, and processed in nearby mills that emitted smoke, heat, and flying debris. Mortality rates were high. Disease, exhaustion, and injury claimed lives quickly. Plantation owners often expected slaves to survive only 7 or 8 years before needing replacement. Rice plantations in South Carolina or the Gambia River colonies presented a different set of challenges. Enslaved people labored in waterlogged fields, contending with insects, snakes, and waterborne diseases like malaria. Their knowledge of cultivation, irrigation, and survival in wetland conditions, often drawn from African experience, was critical, though rarely acknowledged. In these fields, expertise became a form of subtle resistance, asserting the value of knowledge in an otherwise dehumanizing system. Domestic labor, while less physically intense than fieldwork, carried its own hardships. Women were often assigned to kitchens, laundries, and childcare under the strict supervision of housekeepers or the planters themselves. Abuse, long hours, and constant surveillance defined daily life. Even in less visible forms of labor, the system exacted obedience and suppressed autonomy. Amid this brutality, acts of resilience persisted. Enslaved communities developed networks of communication, mutual aid, and cultural preservation. Songs and stories carried warnings, advice, and coded messages. Spiritual practices evolved, blending African traditions with imposed Christian forms, creating unique syncretic belief systems that provided psychological strength and a sense of identity. It is also in this context that I must pause for a moment and ask you to consider something. If you have not already, please subscribe to History in Ashes. Think of it like sugar, except instead of feeding your body, it fuels our ability to continue telling these stories. Without your support, this channel might disappear, and with it, the chance to explore history that isn't found in textbooks. Go ahead, hit that button so we can keep these stories alive, just as those who survived the plantations kept their own culture alive. Returning to the plantations, life was measured in routine and repetition. From sunrise to sunset, the enslaved labored under whips, commands, and fear. Each task had precision: cutting cane, planting, harvesting, transporting loads, or processing raw materials. Supervisors maintained strict oversight, often using violence to enforce compliance. The plantation itself functioned as a microcosm of the larger system, efficient, profitable, and morally detached. Even within these oppressive conditions, ingenuity and adaptation emerged. Tools and techniques imported from Africa were applied to local conditions. Knowledge of agriculture, irrigation, and survival in harsh environments allowed enslaved people to meet demands while preserving aspects of their own expertise. Children learned skills from elders, maintaining cultural continuity despite the system's attempts to erase their heritage. Food and diet were controlled to maximize survival at minimal cost. Basic staples, cornmeal, beans, salted fish, and occasional meat were rationed carefully. Malnutrition and disease were constant threats. Enslaved communities developed strategies to supplement their diets. Small gardens, foraging, fishing, and bartering. These efforts, though often punished when discovered, reflected agency and resilience. Daily life also included rituals and spiritual practice. Despite forced conversion to Christianity, enslaved people maintained African spiritual traditions, often in secret. Dance, song, prayer, and storytelling preserved memory and identity. These practices offered psychological relief, community cohesion, and subtle resistance to total control. Punishments for disobedience were severe. Whipping, isolation, and other forms of corporal discipline were common. Plantation records document both minor infractions and larger acts of rebellion. Yet, even under constant threat, enslaved people continued to resist, feigning illness, slowing work, maintaining forbidden languages, or secretly passing messages. Every act, however small, affirmed their humanity. Over time, some communities began to form autonomous spaces. Maroon societies, settlements of escaped slaves developed in remote areas, from the swamps of Jamaica to the mountains of Brazil. These communities combined African traditions with local knowledge, creating societies that were self-sufficient and resistant to colonial authority. They represented hope, persistence, and defiance. Despite this resilience, the psychological toll remained immense. Family separation, forced labor, and constant surveillance imposed lasting trauma. Generations were shaped by the labor, violence, and strategies of survival required on plantations. Yet in these communities, culture persisted. Music, language, cuisine, and belief systems continued, creating the foundation for diasporic identities across the Americas. The economic engine of plantations was relentless. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rice fed the global markets. Profits were immense and continuous, attracting investment from Europe and America. Entire economies were built on the backs of enslaved labor, and social structures evolved around it. Even after the abolition movements gained traction, the legacy of wealth accumulation and inequality persisted. Historians have examined the minutiae of plantation life extensively. Ledgers, inventories, letters, and legal documents reveal not only the mechanics of labor, but also the humanity of the enslaved, their resistance, ingenuity, and survival strategies. Ordinary acts, such as sharing water, protecting children, or teaching skills in secret, became acts of defiance with lasting consequences. And as the sun set over the sugar fields, over the rice paddies, over the settlements where enslaved people gathered in quiet defiance, one question lingered, unspoken but urgent. If humanity can endure such suffering, what does it mean for the conscience of those who profit from it? Resistance was never absent, even under the most oppressive conditions of the Atlantic slave trade. From the moment captives were seized inland, through the Middle Passage, to life on plantations, acts of defiance, large and small, punctuated the systems designed to suppress humanity. Resistance was physical, psychological, and cultural, reflecting an enduring struggle to retain agency in a world determined to erase it. On the ships, before the arrival at the Americas, the enslaved occasionally organized uprisings. These rebellions were perilous, as ships were small and heavily guarded, but documented cases reveal the determination of people to fight for freedom. Captives coordinated attacks on crew members, attempted to seize weapons, or tried to overpower the officers. Even when unsuccessful, these efforts disrupted the routine of the voyage and forced sailors to maintain vigilance, exposing the trade's inherent instability. The Middle Passage also allowed for smaller forms of resistance. Some captives refused to eat or pretended illness to reduce their value to traders. Others whispered warnings or shared knowledge about escape routes once the ships arrived. The communal spirit that endured in confined spaces, in whispered languages, or clandestine rituals, was a form of psychological resilience that no chains could fully suppress. Upon arrival, the opportunities for organized resistance expanded. The New World presented vast territories, isolated plantations, and dense forests that offered both danger and refuge. Enslaved people who survived the Middle Passage often attempted escape immediately upon disembarkation. Some ran into forests, rivers, or swamps. Others sought to join maroon communities, autonomous settlements of escaped Africans and their descendants. These maroon societies existed across the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America, often living in regions deemed inaccessible or undesirable by European settlers. Rebellion took many forms. Some were spontaneous uprisings on individual plantations. Historical records show large-scale revolts, such as those in Jamaica in 1731, where enslaved men and women coordinated attacks on their overseers and fled into the hills. Others involved more subtle, sustained sabotage, deliberately slowing work, mismanaging crops, or damaging tools and equipment. These acts, often invisible to plantation owners, demonstrated ingenuity and strategic resistance within the constraints of forced labor. Cultural survival was intertwined with resistance. Despite European attempts to erase African traditions, enslaved people preserved languages, spiritual practices, music, and folklore. These cultural elements were not only methods of psychological survival, they were also tools of cohesion and communication. Songs contained coded messages, rituals reinforced communal bonds, and storytelling preserved history. Cultural practices served as living archives, carrying knowledge of homeland, survival strategies, and collective memory across generations. Religion played a complex role. Missionary efforts aimed to convert enslaved Africans to Christianity, often emphasizing obedience and moral instruction. Yet African spiritual traditions persisted, sometimes blending with European forms to create syncretic religions. In the Caribbean, for example, elements of Yoruba, Congo, and Akan beliefs merged with Catholicism, forming practices that provided both solace and covert resistance. Religious gatherings became spaces to reinforce identity, share knowledge, and plan collective actions under the guise of piety. Resistance also manifested in legal and political arenas. In some regions, enslaved people petitioned for freedom, used courts to contest mistreatment, or leveraged alliances with sympathetic individuals. While often limited in impact and fraught with danger, these efforts demonstrated an awareness of legal structures and a willingness to challenge the system within its own frameworks. Throughout the Americas, maroon communities became centers of sustained resistance. They were often located in remote areas, swamps in South Carolina, mountains in Jamaica, forests in Brazil where Europeans had limited access. These communities developed self-sustaining economies, cultivating food, maintaining security, and preserving African customs. Maroons occasionally conducted raids on plantations, freeing others or reclaiming resources. Their existence challenged colonial authority and the perception of total control, proving that resistance was viable even under extreme oppression. Communication between enslaved people facilitated collective action. Networks spread information about escape routes, patrol schedules, and market conditions. Knowledge of geography, local ecology, and colonial infrastructure became essential tools for survival. Captives adapted skills from Africa, agriculture, carpentry, fishing to new environments, increasing both resilience and autonomy. These adaptations demonstrate the continuity of African expertise and the ingenuity required to navigate the imposed systems of labor. The psychological aspects of resistance were equally significant. Maintaining cultural memory, family connections, and personal identity were forms of defiance in themselves. Enslaved people developed strategies to cope with trauma. Storytelling, ritual, music, and clandestine gatherings reinforced communal bonds and offered hope. Even in the smallest acts, teaching a child a song from home, preparing a traditional meal, or secretly marking a significant day resistance persisted. Violence was sometimes unavoidable. Large-scale rebellions were met with severe reprisals. Plantation records document mass executions, whippings, and public punishment intended to deter further uprisings. Despite this, resistance endured. The persistence of revolt, rebellion, and cultural preservation reveals the inherent instability of a system that relied on domination, fear, and violence for survival. Gender played a specific role in resistance. Women, while subjected to both labor and sexual exploitation, often led clandestine activities. They organized secret gatherings, transmitted knowledge, and protected children. Women's roles in maroon communities, spiritual practices, and domestic acts of defiance were crucial in sustaining cultural continuity and collective resistance. The intellectual dimensions of resistance should not be overlooked. Enslaved people remembered historical events, navigated political landscapes, and developed strategies to negotiate survival. This cognitive engagement, often invisible in historical records, was essential for both immediate survival and long-term cultural persistence. Even when constrained by physical labor and coercion, enslaved Africans retained agency through knowledge, memory, and strategic action. In some cases, enslaved people leveraged European rivalries to their advantage. During colonial wars, they offered labor or intelligence to one European power in exchange for promises of freedom or improved treatment. While these negotiations rarely guaranteed liberty, they demonstrate the adaptive strategies employed within a constrained environment. Survival, in this context, became a form of resistance, a negotiation between imposed structures and human ingenuity. Music, storytelling, and oral traditions continued to serve as repositories of knowledge. Drums, rhythms, and chants encoded information about geography, work schedules, and security. Stories of past resistance, ancestral knowledge, and survival strategies were passed from one generation to the next. These practices not only preserved African identity, but also contributed to the formation of new cultural expressions in the Americas. Throughout the Americas, enslaved people maintained networks across plantations, settlements, and maroon communities. These networks allowed for the spread of information, coordination of escape attempts, and preservation of cultural practices. Despite extreme surveillance and punitive measures, the enslaved leveraged these connections to resist isolation and maintain a sense of collective identity. The cumulative effect of resistance was both subtle and profound. While colonial powers measured control in obedience and output, the enslaved created spaces of autonomy, negotiated survival, and preserved cultural memory. Even small acts, hiding food, teaching a child, preserving a song, undermined the system's totalizing claims. Resistance was not always visible in historical records, but its impact shaped the social and cultural landscape of the Americas for centuries. This continuum of defiance, adaptation, and resilience underscores a critical truth. The Atlantic slave trade was never absolute in its power to dehumanize. While it imposed extraordinary suffering, enslaved Africans maintained agency in every possible way, reshaping the New World through their survival, culture, and resistance. By understanding resistance in its many forms, physical, cultural, psychological, and intellectual, historians recognize the full complexity of the enslaved experience. Resistance was not always dramatic. It was often quiet, invisible, and persistent. It was encoded in language, preserved in ritual, and enacted in daily choices. And as we reflect on these acts of survival and defiance, the question remains, if people can resist under unimaginable oppression, what lessons does that endurance offer to us today in confronting injustice and preserving humanity? The Atlantic slave trade reshaped not only individual lives, but entire continents. Its consequences were economic, social, and cultural, leaving legacies that persist centuries later. By transporting millions of people from Africa to the Americas, the trade fundamentally altered demographics, labor systems, and patterns of wealth, creating a global economy that depended on human bondage. In the Americas, the influx of enslaved Africans transformed agriculture and industry. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee became the foundation of colonial economies. Plantations spread across the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America, requiring large, organized labor forces. Enslaved people were central to these operations, providing the skills, knowledge, and labor that made large-scale production feasible. Their contribution, though unacknowledged at the time, was indispensable to the economic rise of European empires. The production of these commodities created vast wealth for European merchants, plantation owners, and investors. Cities like Liverpool, Nantes, and Amsterdam prospered, becoming centers of finance, shipbuilding, and trade. Banks, insurance companies, and trading companies expanded, creating the infrastructure of modern capitalism. The trade was a driving force in the development of credit systems, investment practices, and insurance policies, linking continents through a network of commerce built on exploitation. Beyond economics, the trade had profound demographic effects. Entire regions of West and Central Africa experienced population loss, especially of young men and women who were most likely to be enslaved. This loss destabilized societies, disrupted family structures, and altered local economies. Communities had to reorganize around new social and political realities, often intensifying warfare or changing patterns of agriculture and settlement to cope with labor shortages. In Africa, the demand for captives incentivized warfare and raiding. States such as Dahomey, Ashanti, and Oyo expanded military campaigns to capture prisoners for trade. In some cases, smaller communities were systematically targeted and depopulated. The export of enslaved people created a perverse form of economic integration. African kingdoms became entangled in a global system they could neither control nor escape, reliant on European goods while simultaneously undermining local stability. Culturally, the transatlantic journey carried African traditions, beliefs, and practices into the Americas. Enslaved people preserved languages, religious rituals, music, and storytelling, blending them with new experiences to create diasporic cultures. In Brazil, for example, African religious practices fused with Catholicism to produce candomblé. In the Caribbean, Yoruba and Akan traditions mixed with European influences, giving rise to syncretic spiritual systems. Even within oppressive environments, these cultural forms persisted and adapted, shaping communities across generations. Music and performance became tools of survival and identity. Drumming, singing, and dance provided not only emotional release, but a medium for coded communication. Field hollers, work songs, and spirituals contained information about escape, resistance, and communal support. These traditions were integral to maintaining cohesion and preserving memory, even when enslaved people were deliberately dispersed across plantations or colonies to limit their connections. Family structures also transformed under the trade. In the Americas, enslaved people often married or partnered across ethnic lines, forming networks of kinship under extreme duress. While European powers sought to fragment African communities, enslaved individuals reconstructed family ties, creating social systems that sustained community and resilience. Children became repositories of memory, carrying forward knowledge, language, and rituals learned from elders. Economically, the trade created dependencies across the Atlantic world. The Americas relied on enslaved labor to produce export crops. European merchants relied on profits from the sale of commodities, and African intermediaries relied on trade for goods and power. The system was cyclical. Plantations generated profits, European ports invested in further voyages, and African states continued to supply captives. Entire societies became entwined in the machinery of slavery, reinforcing hierarchies and inequalities that endured long after the trade ended. Resistance and cultural survival were crucial to this system's dynamics. By preserving traditions, skills, and social structures, enslaved Africans maintained the potential for autonomy, defying complete erasure. Maroon communities, spiritual practices, and covert networks of communication challenged the notion that the trade could fully control human life. These forms of resistance shaped the cultural landscapes of the Americas, influencing music, cuisine, religion, and language in ways that endure to this day. The trade also accelerated global integration. Raw materials produced by enslaved labor fueled European industry. Trade networks connected continents, and capital accumulated in cities across the Atlantic. Financial instruments, such as insurance policies and joint stock companies, spread risk and profits. These developments laid the foundations for modern capitalism, demonstrating how deeply human exploitation became embedded in global economic structures. The environmental impact was significant as well. Large-scale plantations altered ecosystems, replaced native vegetation with monocultures, and introduced new agricultural practices. Soil depletion, deforestation, and the importation of new crops reshaped the landscape. The forced introduction of African agricultural knowledge mitigated some effects, yet the ecological transformations were profound and lasting. In Africa, the trade intensified social stratification. Elites who participated in the trade gained access to European goods, weapons, and political advantage, while ordinary communities faced disruption, displacement, and depopulation. These inequalities persisted long after the trade ended, influencing political dynamics, territorial disputes, and economic structures in the post-slavery period. The psychological consequences were equally enduring. The trauma of forced migration, family separation, and labor exploitation reverberated across generations. Memory, however, proved resilient. Enslaved people transmitted knowledge orally, preserving history, culture, and identity. Despite the deliberate efforts of European powers to suppress African heritage, these traditions survived and adapted, shaping the Americas in ways that are still visible today. The trade also reshaped social hierarchies. In the Americas, racialized systems of oppression developed, codified in law and custom. European settlers justified slavery through ideology, religion, and pseudo-scientific reasoning, constructing a worldview in which the exploitation of Africans was naturalized. These hierarchies persisted through centuries, influencing politics, economics, and social structures well into the modern era. Even after abolition, the economic consequences remained. Formerly enslaved labor contributed to the accumulation of capital, the establishment of industries, and the expansion of commerce. European and American wealth often rested directly on the profits derived from slavery, highlighting how deeply the system shaped global development. Meanwhile, African societies had to recover from population loss, political destabilization, and the disruption of social networks, challenges that affected generations. Culturally, the trade produced hybrid identities. In the Americas, African languages, music, religious practices, and culinary traditions merged with European and indigenous influences. These hybrid forms shaped communities, creating distinct diasporic cultures. Carnival traditions, gospel music, capoeira, and Afro-Brazilian rituals all trace roots to the survival and adaptation of African heritage under oppressive circumstances. Education and literacy were tools of both oppression and resilience. Enslaved people were often denied formal education, yet literacy, when attained, became a powerful means of resistance. Written accounts, petitions, and clandestine documents preserved knowledge, enabled communication, and challenged the narratives imposed by colonial authorities. These efforts illustrate the intellectual dimension of survival and defiance, complementing physical and cultural forms of resistance. The Atlantic slave trade also reshaped family, gender, and labor dynamics. Enslaved women played critical roles, balancing reproductive labor, childcare, fieldwork, and domestic responsibilities. Men often worked in physically demanding roles, but also participated in community organization, clandestine resistance, and knowledge preservation. These gendered experiences highlight the complexity of survival strategies and the interdependence of social networks. The global consequences of the trade were profound. European economies, African societies, and American colonies became tightly interdependent, tied together by human labor and the commodities it produced. This integration accelerated the expansion of commerce, finance, and industrialization. The wealth generated enabled scientific exploration, military expansion, and urban development, all rooted in exploitation. Even today, the legacies of the trade remain visible. Social inequalities, cultural hybridity, and economic disparities trace their origins, in part, to the Atlantic slave trade. Diasporic communities carry languages, customs, and memories that survived centuries of displacement. Understanding these legacies requires acknowledging the deep interconnections between economic structures, cultural survival, and resistance throughout history. And so the question emerges: if the Atlantic slave trade reshaped the world in ways both visible and invisible, how do we trace the threads of resilience, culture, and memory across centuries to understand our present? By the late 18th century, the Atlantic slave trade had reached its peak in scale, profit, and brutality. Yet, beneath the surface of commerce and control, opposition was growing. Abolitionist movements emerged in Europe and the Americas, fueled by moral, religious, economic, and intellectual arguments. These movements would eventually challenge the legitimacy of the trade, setting the stage for legal prohibitions and social transformation. In Europe, the moral critique of slavery gained momentum through the writings of philosophers, theologians, and campaigners. Quakers in England, with their emphasis on equality and conscience, became some of the earliest organized voices against the trade. They published pamphlets, circulated petitions, and lobbied Parliament, framing slavery not only as an economic system, but as a profound ethical failing. The Quaker emphasis on human dignity contrasted sharply with the prevailing view of enslaved people as property. Other religious groups joined the critique. Evangelical Christians in Britain, inspired by figures such as John Wesley, denounced the trade as a sin against God. Sermons, books, and letters depicted the suffering endured by captives, appealing to compassion and moral responsibility. These campaigns were often graphic and persuasive, presenting statistics, eyewitness accounts, and narratives of enslaved people to illustrate the scale of human suffering. The rise of Enlightenment thought contributed to growing opposition. Philosophers like Montesquieu and Rousseau questioned systems of inequality, emphasizing reason, natural rights, and liberty. These ideas provided intellectual ammunition to campaigners who argued that slavery violated universal human principles. While many European elites remained economically invested in the trade, public opinion slowly shifted, particularly in urban centers where information circulated through newspapers, pamphlets, and discussion societies. In Britain, the abolitionist movement coalesced into organized campaigns by the mid-18th century. Figures like Granville, Sharp, and Thomas Clarkson conducted research, compiled evidence, and toured the country to raise awareness. They highlighted not only the moral corruption of the trade but its social consequences, emphasizing that wealth built on human suffering could not sustain a just society. Petitions, public lectures, and illustrations depicting enslaved Africans shackled in the hold of ships brought the realities of the trade into the public consciousness. These efforts were complemented by grassroots activism. Ordinary citizens joined boycotts of sugar produced by enslaved labor, forming networks of ethical consumption that challenged merchants and raised awareness. Women's groups, in particular, played a significant role in organizing petitions and campaigns, demonstrating that resistance to the trade was not limited to intellectuals or clergy. Collective action created pressure on governments, leading to legislative efforts to curtail the trade. In the Americas, resistance to the trade and slavery itself remained constant. Enslaved people continued to revolt, escape, and maintain cultural practices. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1971, represents one of the most consequential examples of this resistance. Led by formerly enslaved individuals, the revolution succeeded in overthrowing French colonial control and establishing Haiti as the first independent nation in the Americas, ruled by people of African descent. The revolution demonstrated that organized resistance could achieve political as well as personal liberation. Elsewhere in the Americas, enslaved populations engaged in smaller-scale revolts, work slowdowns, and acts of sabotage. Communities communicated through clandestine networks, preserved African languages and customs, and created maroon settlements in inaccessible terrain. These acts of resistance influenced public opinion in Europe and underscored the unsustainability of systems dependent on coercion and fear. Economic arguments also contributed to abolition. Some merchants and politicians argued that slavery was inefficient or unprofitable compared to emerging forms of labor. Industrialization in Britain reduced reliance on plantation-produced goods, while wage labor in factories offered alternative models of production. This combination of moral and economic reasoning created a broader consensus that the trade was both ethically indefensible and increasingly unnecessary for national prosperity. Legislation began to codify these ideas. Britain passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1813, making it illegal to engage in the Atlantic slave trade. Enforcement was challenging, requiring naval patrols along the African coast and in the Atlantic to intercept illegal shipments. Despite loopholes and continued clandestine trading, the law marked a turning point, signaling official rejection of the trade as a legitimate institution. Other European powers followed over subsequent decades. Denmark had passed legislation earlier, in 1912, banning its participation in the trade, while France and Spain gradually imposed restrictions, though enforcement remained inconsistent. The legal end of the trade did not immediately end slavery itself. Enslaved populations in colonies continued to labor under coercion for years, sometimes decades. Nonetheless, abolition of the trade represented a crucial step toward dismantling the system at its root. In the United States, debates over the trade were entangled with politics, regional economies, and emerging national identity. The importation of enslaved Africans was banned in 1912, yet domestic slavery persisted. The legacy of the trade influenced legal frameworks, social hierarchies, and economic development, illustrating that formal abolition addressed only part of a far-reaching system. Abolitionist movements were aided by literature and personal narratives. Accounts by formerly enslaved individuals, such as Olaudah Equiano, circulated widely, providing first-hand testimony of the horrors endured. These narratives humanized the victims of the trade, challenging abstract economic reasoning with vivid, emotional accounts of suffering and resilience. By making the enslaved voices heard, literature contributed to moral and political pressure for legislative change. Naval enforcement played a critical role after legal bans were implemented. The British Royal Navy established patrols off the West African coast to intercept illegal slaving vessels, freeing captives when possible. These operations, while limited in scope, demonstrated the logistical commitment required to enforce abolition. They also highlighted the persistence of profit-driven incentives that drove illegal trade long after official bans. Resistance and abolition were interconnected. Without the persistent defiance of enslaved populations through revolt, escape, and the preservation of culture, the moral and political arguments for abolition might have lacked urgency in public consciousness. The struggle for freedom was both grassroots and institutional, blending everyday acts of survival with legislative and intellectual advocacy. Education and awareness continued to be central to abolitionist strategies. Pamphlets, lectures, and newspapers circulated widely in Britain, France, and the Americas, creating informed publics that could pressure policymakers. Illustrations, maps of trade routes, and statistical evidence made abstract moral arguments tangible, allowing citizens to visualize the scale of human suffering. Public opinion, informed by documentation and advocacy, became a powerful tool in the movement to end the trade. By the 19th century, the combined efforts of enslaved resistance, abolitionist activism, economic shifts, and moral critique brought the Atlantic slave trade to a formal end. Yet the process was gradual and uneven. Smuggling continued, enforcement was inconsistent, and colonial economies remained dependent on enslaved labor. Abolition marked the beginning of change, but the deep social, cultural, and economic consequences of the trade persisted long afterward. The legal end of the trade also forced reflection on the global system it had sustained. European powers had profited immensely from enslaved labor. African states had been reshaped by the supply of captives, and the Americas had been transformed by new populations, labor structures, and cultures. Abolition did not erase these effects, but it challenged the notion that such systems could continue indefinitely without moral, political, and social consequences. Resistance to the trade, in all its forms, remained central to understanding its end. From whispered instructions on ships to revolts on plantations, from maroon societies to the advocacy of literate campaigners, the Atlantic slave trade was never uncontested. Abolition emerged not simply from legislation or moral reasoning alone, but from the cumulative effect of persistent defiance, awareness, and strategic action. The story of abolition is therefore intertwined with survival, resilience, and the assertion of human dignity. It reminds us that systemic oppression can be challenged through multiple avenues: resistance, advocacy, moral reasoning, and political action. The end of the Atlantic slave trade illustrates both the limits of exploitation and the enduring capacity for human agency. As we reflect on this history, one question persists. If persistent resistance and moral clarity brought an end to one of the most brutal systems in human history, what lessons does that history hold for confronting injustice in our own time? The formal abolition of the Atlantic slave trade did not mark the end of its effects. For the millions who survived, freedom was not immediate, simple, or guaranteed. The post-abolition period was a complex time of adaptation, negotiation, and reconstruction, as formerly enslaved people navigated new realities in societies shaped by centuries of bondage. In the Caribbean, North America, and Brazil, newly freed populations faced the challenge of asserting autonomy in societies structured around their previous oppression. Land ownership was rare, economic opportunities were limited, and legal systems often continued to enforce racial hierarchies. Freed people had to negotiate survival in spaces where European settlers retained political and economic dominance. Despite these constraints, communities emerged, creating schools, churches, and cultural institutions that preserved memory and identity. Maroon societies, which had long existed as autonomous communities of escaped enslaved people, continued to play a crucial role. These settlements, located in remote mountains, swamps, or forests, provided safety and autonomy. They also served as hubs for cultural preservation, social organization, and resistance. Some Maroon communities negotiated formal treaties with colonial governments, gaining limited recognition in exchange for policing escaped enslaved individuals or maintaining peace, illustrating both strategic adaptation and the ongoing tension between autonomy and imposed authority. In urban areas, freed populations formed neighborhoods and communities that became centers of cultural resilience. Markets, religious institutions, and social networks provided economic and social support. Music, dance, and storytelling preserved African heritage while blending with local and European influences. In cities like Salvador, Kingston, and New Orleans, these communities contributed significantly to the development of local economies and cultural landscapes. Education emerged as a critical tool for adaptation and empowerment. Freed populations established schools, often with the support of missionary societies or sympathetic organizations. Literacy enabled access to legal systems, economic opportunities, and broader social networks. Teaching children their history, language, and cultural practices became a form of resistance, ensuring that the lessons of survival, resilience, and identity were transmitted across generations. Economic adaptation required ingenuity. Formerly enslaved people engaged in subsistence farming, skilled trades, or small-scale commerce. In Brazil, some acquired land through purchase or negotiated work agreements. In the Caribbean, labor contracts, though often exploitative, provided limited autonomy. These efforts reflect a persistent drive to reclaim agency and secure basic rights, even in environments shaped by the enduring legacy of slavery. Cultural resilience continued to be a cornerstone of adaptation. Religious practices, music, and storytelling were central to maintaining a sense of identity. Festivals and communal gatherings celebrated survival, remembrance, and community cohesion. These events reinforced social bonds, transmitted knowledge, and provided psychological relief, serving both as cultural preservation and as subtle forms of ongoing resistance to social marginalization. The legacies of slavery also shaped legal and social systems. In many former colonies, laws codified racial hierarchies, restricting land ownership, voting rights, and civil liberties for people of African descent. Despite formal freedom, social mobility was limited and discrimination persisted. Freed populations navigated these challenges by building communities, creating informal economies, and asserting cultural influence in ways that slowly reshaped societal structures. Migration patterns emerged as a response to both opportunity and restriction. Freed populations moved within colonies, across borders, and sometimes to newly established nations or territories. These movements facilitated cultural exchange, the spread of skills and knowledge, and the establishment of diasporic networks. Communication and kinship networks remained central to survival and resilience, linking communities across space and time. The psychological impact of slavery and the trade remained profound. Generations had experienced trauma, family separation, and systemic dehumanization. Communities developed strategies for coping and healing, often rooted in cultural continuity, spiritual practice, and communal solidarity. Storytelling and oral histories played a central role, preserving memory and offering guidance for navigating post-slavery life. Economic systems in former colonies also underwent transformation. Plantations gradually shifted toward wage labor, sharecropping, or mechanized production. While these systems did not eliminate inequality, they altered the dynamics of labor, creating opportunities for negotiation, skill application, and limited economic mobility. Freed populations leveraged their knowledge of agriculture, craft, and trade to assert influence within these new structures. In North America, the abolition of the trade preceded the broader abolition of slavery, creating a distinct historical context. Freed populations in northern states began establishing schools, churches, and civic organizations. In southern states, the Civil War and subsequent Reconstruction period reshaped legal and social frameworks, though persistent discrimination and segregation continued to restrict opportunity. The adaptation of freed populations involved both survival strategies and deliberate institution building to protect communities and assert autonomy. In Brazil, where slavery persisted longer than in most other regions, the abolition of the trade required ongoing negotiation. Freed populations gradually claimed rights to land, labor, and citizenship, often contending with entrenched planter interests. Urban centers became hubs of social organization, education, and cultural expression. Music, religion, and communal rituals served both as cultural continuity and as mechanisms for asserting dignity in societies shaped by prior oppression. The legacies of the Atlantic slave trade are also evident in demographic patterns. Populations in the Americas reflect complex histories of forced migration, cultural mixing, and adaptation. Language, cuisine, religious practice, and music carry traces of African heritage interwoven with European and indigenous influences. These hybrid identities illustrate both the trauma and resilience inherent in the transatlantic experience. Resistance persisted in post-abolition societies, not always through overt revolt, but through subtle forms of social, cultural, and economic assertion. Communities maintained networks of mutual aid, protected children's education, and preserved memory through storytelling and ritual. These practices reinforced agency and identity, highlighting the ongoing impact of human resilience in the face of systemic oppression. Global awareness of these legacies has grown through historical scholarship, literature, and cultural studies. Understanding the post-abolition period requires attention to continuity as well as change. The ways freed populations navigated legal, economic, and social systems shaped by centuries of exploitation, while simultaneously asserting identity, culture, and autonomy. The trade's consequences also reverberated in Africa. Depopulation, political destabilization, and economic shifts persisted long after formal abolition. Communities had to rebuild social structures, recover from the loss of labor, and adapt to new political realities. While some regions experienced recovery, others faced ongoing disruption, illustrating the long-term impact of the trade on continental development. Health and demographics continued to be affected. Descendants of enslaved populations often confronted intergenerational trauma, malnutrition, and social marginalization. Yet, in many cases, these communities developed strategies for survival, adaptation, and resilience, using knowledge, culture, and communal solidarity as tools for long-term stability. Migration, both voluntary and forced, continued to shape societies. Freed populations often moved in search of economic opportunity, safety, or reunification with family networks. These movements reinforced diasporic connections, facilitated cultural exchange, and allowed for the spread of traditions, beliefs, and social strategies across regions. Education and literacy remained central to adaptation. Freed populations prioritized learning as a means of empowerment, transmitting knowledge to children and establishing institutions that preserved both heritage and access to opportunity. Schools, libraries, and informal educational networks became pillars of community resilience. Despite the enormous challenges, the post-abolition period also demonstrated human ingenuity and agency. Freed populations carved out spaces of autonomy, maintained cultural traditions, and negotiated economic survival. The strategies developed in these decades laid the foundation for future generations to assert social, political, and cultural influence, shaping societies across the Americas and beyond. And as we reflect on the post-abolition world, the question emerges: if freedom arrived after centuries of forced labor and displacement, how do communities rebuild identity, culture, and social cohesion in the shadow of systemic exploitation? The Atlantic slave trade was not merely a historical episode confined to the past. Its legacies ripple across continents, societies, and generations. Centuries after the last enslaved person arrived in the Americas, the structures, cultures, and inequalities it created continue to shape the world. Understanding these long-term consequences is essential for grasping both historical patterns and contemporary realities. Economically, the trade laid the foundations of global capitalism. Wealth accumulated through the forced labor of millions fueled European industrialization, urban development, and financial expansion. Cities like Liverpool, Nantes, Amsterdam, and Lisbon flourished on profits derived from enslaved labor. These profits funded infrastructure, investment in new industries, and the rise of financial institutions whose influence persists today. The extraction of value from human beings created not only immediate wealth, but enduring economic imbalances between nations and regions. In the Americas, the demographic and cultural consequences of the trade are evident in modern populations. Millions of descendants of enslaved Africans live across North America, the Caribbean, and South America. Their presence shaped languages, religions, music, cuisine, and social structures. From samba in Brazil to gospel in the United States, from Caribbean carnivals to Afro-Caribbean culinary traditions, cultural expressions carry the imprint of African heritage. These traditions are living legacies, testifying to resilience, adaptation, and creativity despite systemic oppression. Social hierarchies established during slavery also left enduring marks. Racialized systems of inequality, legal discrimination, and social stratification emerged to justify and maintain bondage. Although formal slavery ended, these structures persisted in segregation, restricted access to education and employment, and systemic marginalization. The impact is measurable in contemporary social and economic disparities, demonstrating that the consequences of centuries-old exploitation are not merely historical, they shape modern life. Memory and historiography play a central role in preserving the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade. Scholars, historians, and activists have worked to uncover the full scope of the trade, moving beyond numbers to emphasize individual experiences, cultural survival, and resistance. Documenting the stories of enslaved individuals, maroon communities, and abolitionist movements provides insight into resilience, agency, and the complexity of human experience under oppression. Museums, archives, and memorials contribute to this process. Exhibits in the Americas, Europe, and Africa illuminate the trade's history, displaying artifacts, documents, and visual narratives. Oral histories, music, and literature preserve memory in forms that connect the past to the present. Commemoration is not passive. It is an active engagement with history, challenging societies to confront uncomfortable truths and acknowledge the enduring impact of the trade. Education is a critical site for legacy preservation. Curricula that integrate the Atlantic slave trade, its human consequences, and its cultural legacies allow younger generations to understand both suffering and resilience. Teaching history in a nuanced, contextualized way emphasizes agency, survival, and the complexity of human societies. It fosters critical thinking about systemic oppression, moral responsibility, and the interconnectedness of global histories. The global reach of the trade is striking. Africa experienced depopulation, political destabilization, and economic disruption. European powers profited immensely, building empires and financial systems grounded in exploitation. The Americas were transformed by labor systems, cultural hybridity, and social hierarchies. These interconnections created a truly transatlantic system, whose consequences are evident in contemporary economic, social, and cultural relationships among continents. Resistance and cultural survival remain central to understanding legacy. The practices that enslaved Africans preserved music, storytelling, spiritual traditions, language-shaped identity, and influenced subsequent generations. Cultural retention served as a form of resistance, allowing communities to maintain cohesion, transmit knowledge, and assert humanity in the face of oppression. These legacies persist today in diasporic communities and global culture, demonstrating the enduring power of human resilience. Modern activism draws on the memory of the trade. Movements for racial justice, social equity, and reparations often reference the historical consequences of slavery. Knowledge of history informs demands for systemic change, highlighting connections between past exploitation and contemporary inequality. Understanding the trade's legacy provides both context and moral urgency for addressing lingering social injustices. Art and literature continue to engage with the Atlantic slave trade. Novels, poetry, films, and music explore its human dimensions, portraying suffering, resilience, and cultural creativity. These expressions allow contemporary audiences to connect emotionally with history, fostering empathy and understanding. They bridge temporal and spatial divides, transforming historical documentation into lived experience for those who encounter it today. The study of enslaved individuals' adaptation and survival provides insight into human ingenuity. Despite systematic attempts to erase culture, enslaved populations preserved knowledge, adapted skills, and maintained social networks. This resilience influenced labor systems, agricultural practices, and cultural life in the Americas. By examining adaptation strategies, historians recognize the agency of the enslaved rather than portraying them solely as victims. Global recognition of the Atlantic slave trade's legacy has also led to debates over commemoration, public memory, and restitution. Monuments, museums, and educational programs serve not only to remember victims but to acknowledge responsibility and encourage reflection. These efforts confront societies with the uncomfortable truth that past exploitation has contemporary consequences, inviting dialogue on ethical responsibility, historical accountability, and collective memory. Demographic patterns continue to reflect the trade's impact. African-descended populations shaped urban development, labor structures, and social norms in the Americas. Cultural hybridity, the blending of African, European, and indigenous traditions, emerged as both a product of survival and a creative adaptation. From language to food to music, these hybrid forms illustrate the interplay between oppression, resilience, and cultural evolution. Health, psychology, and intergenerational trauma are also part of the legacy. Descendants of enslaved populations carry the effects of displacement, violence, and systemic marginalization. Understanding these effects requires a historical lens that links past trauma to contemporary social conditions. Research in sociology, psychology, and public health underscores how deeply historical oppression continues to influence present realities. Political systems were influenced as well. Freed populations participated in shaping new nations, asserting civil rights, and challenging institutionalized inequality. From Haiti's revolution to Reconstruction in the United States, political action reflected both the desire for autonomy and the lasting effects of systemic oppression. These experiences illustrate the interplay between history and contemporary political consciousness. Even geography bears traces of the trade. Settlement patterns, plantation locations, and urban development reflect historical systems of labor and exploitation. The forced movement of millions reshaped demographics, influencing cultural, economic, and social dynamics across continents. Understanding geography in this context is essential to understanding both historical and contemporary societal structures. Memory of the trade is both local and global. Communities preserve history through ritual, storytelling, monuments, and educational programs. Diasporic connections link continents, creating shared cultural spaces that remember both suffering and survival. By maintaining these memories, societies reinforce the importance of history in shaping identity, community, and moral responsibility. The Atlantic slave trade also challenges assumptions about progress. Economic growth, industrialization, and empire were built on human suffering. Recognition of this reality forces a re-evaluation of conventional narratives of development and modernity. History is not only a record of achievement, but also a record of cost, raising questions about ethical responsibility and the consequences of exploitation. Cultural resilience remains central to the trade's enduring legacy. Music, art, religion, and oral traditions demonstrate continuity and adaptation. These forms are not merely expressions of creativity, they are mechanisms of survival, resistance, and identity. They remind us that even under extreme oppression, humans retain the capacity for adaptation, connection, and meaning-making. Global dialogues today emphasize the moral and ethical dimensions of the trade. Reparations, acknowledgement of historical responsibility, and educational reform are part of ongoing discussions. Addressing the trade's legacy requires more than remembrance. It demands engagement with justice, equity, and the consequences of systemic exploitation that continue to affect millions worldwide. Finally, as we look across the Atlantic and beyond, the question emerges: if the Atlantic slave trade reshaped the world in ways both visible and invisible, and if memory, culture, and resilience survived its brutality, what lessons does it offer us about human endurance, moral responsibility, and the work of justice in the present day?